The morning sun rose over Jerusalem, casting golden light across its ancient walls, but peace was absent from its air. In the early hours, hundreds of Israeli settlers, under the heavy protection of police forces, advanced towards the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, the Mug Harbor Gate, a frequent entry point for such coordinated incursions, became the stage for another confrontation. With military precision, settlers streamed through the gate, some dressed in religious garments, others holding Israeli flags. As they entered the courtyard of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, many began performing Talmudic rituals and prayer sessions, actions considered deeply provocative by the Palestinian Muslim population. Inside the compound, the atmosphere quickly shifted. Palestinian worshippers, many of whom had spent the night in prayer, stood in disbelief and resistance. Chants of protest erupted. Allahu Akbar echoed through the marble walls. But they were soon met with force. Israeli police units, armed and on alert, pushed back the worshippers. Reports emerged of several Palestinians being detained and many more being physically removed from the area. The intention was clear: to secure the settlers' access at any cost. Roads leading to the Old City were blocked. Security checkpoints swelled with tension. Israeli forces transformed the surroundings into what eyewitnesses described as a military barracks. Helicopters hovered above. Surveillance drones buzzed low. Palestinians attempting to reach the mosque were turned back, questioned, or detained. Friday prayers were heavily restricted. Elderly worshippers and women were allowed limited access. Young men, often the voice of protest, were denied entry altogether. The incursion was not spontaneous. It coincided with the Jewish religious event known as Tisha B'Av, a day of mourning for the destruction of the ancient Jewish temples believed to have once stood on the Temple Mount. Far-right Israeli organizations had openly called for mass visits to the compound, encouraging their followers to challenge the fragile religious status quo. Nationalist slogans were shouted. Banners were raised. Social media accounts affiliated with these groups broadcasted the event live, celebrating what they called a spiritual reclaiming. But for Palestinians and the wider Muslim world, the act was seen differently. It was an aggression, a provocation, and a step toward what many fear is a gradual attempt to divide the site both spatially and temporally, allowing Jews to pray in certain hours or zones. This violates a long-standing agreement upheld by international law and religious consensus that Al-Aqsa is a Muslim-only place of worship. The Jordan-run Islamic Waqf, which administers a mosque, issued a strongly worded condemnation. This is not a visit. This is a storming, said one Waqf official. It violates every agreement, every understanding, and every line of religious respect. They warned that continued provocations would ignite wider unrest not just in Jerusalem, but across the occupied territories. Videos shared online showed Israeli settlers celebrating inside the compound. Children were seen reciting religious verses. One man stood defiantly in front of the Dome of the Rock, raising a Torah scroll high. These scenes caused an outcry in Gaza, the West Bank, and even among Arab nations with diplomatic ties to Israel. Condemnations floating from Turkey, Qatar, Jordan, and Egypt. Al-Azhar University in Cairo labeled the incursion a blatant insult to Islamic sanctity. Yet, as the settlers exited the mosque hours later under armed escort, the damage was done. Not a single stone had moved, yet the foundations of coexistence had again been shaken. The sacred ground remained, but the question echoed to the alleyways of Jerusalem. For how long will it remain untouched? The incursion into Al-Aqsa Mosque that day wasn't just a physical act. It was a political message, a challenge to the status quo, and a spark in a powder keg city always on the brink. Jerusalem's silence afterward wasn't peace. It was a calm before another inevitable storm. The hours following the storming of Al-Aqsa Mosque were thick with tension. Across East Jerusalem, the news spread rapidly. Markets went quiet. Shopkeepers pulled down their shutters, and people gathered in hushed clusters discussing what had just unfolded at one of the holiest sites in Islam. The violation was not just of a place, but a sacred trust, a status quo agreement honored for decades, now undermined in full daylight. In the narrow alleyways of the old city, Palestinian youth prepared for what felt like the inevitable. Makeshift barricades appeared near Damascus Gate. Stones were collected and bundled under plastic sheets. Social media buzzed with calls to protect Al-Aqsa. To the mosque, read the posts. We will not let it fall. Young men and women, many in their teens, masked their faces, awaiting confrontation. To them, this wasn't just about religion. It was about identity, heritage, and the right to exist with dignity. Israeli forces, already deployed in large numbers, received reinforcements. Tactical units in riot gear began sweeping through the alleys, dispersing any groups larger than 3. Tear gas canisters were fired. Rubber bullets cracked through the morning air. Within hours, the streets turned chaotic. Clashes erupted near Lions Gate and Wadi Al-Jaz. Smoke billowed from dumpsters set ablaze. Sirens blared as ambulances rushed in to treat the injured. In the West Bank, protests ignited. From Hebron to Ramallah, demonstrators poured into the streets waving Palestinian flags and chanting against the occupation. Some carried signs depicting the Al-Aqsa Mosque under threat. Others held pictures of wounded worshippers. Roadblocks were erected along key highways. Skirmishes broke out at Israeli military checkpoints. In Nablus, a general strike was announced. Schools shut down. Businesses stayed closed. The call was simple: solidarity with Jerusalem. In Gaza, armed factions issued warnings. Al-Aqsa is a red line, declared spokespersons from both Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Militants paraded through refugee camps with rifles raised high. Rockets weren't fired, yet, but the message was unmistakable. If Al-Aqsa is violated again, the resistance will respond. Israeli aircraft circle above Gaza's coast in a visible show of force. The threat of another round of conflict loomed just above the surface. International reactions began to surface. The Turkish Foreign Ministry denounced the incursion as barbaric and calculated. Jordan's royal court issued a rare statement, warning that continued violations of Al-Aqsa could collapse their peace treaty with Israel. The United Nations envoy to the Middle East expressed grave concern over the deteriorating situation and called for restraint from both sides. But in Jerusalem, restraint was hard to find. Back at the Al-Aqsa compound, the aftermath was visible. Shoes, prayer mats, and Quran pages lay scattered on the marble floors. The courtyards were eerily empty, save for a few Waqf officials and Israeli police. The once bustling spiritual space was now silent, guarded, and restricted. Muslim worshippers were still denied access under the pretext of security. Meanwhile, reports emerged that more settler groups were planning additional visits in the coming days. Inside Palestinian homes, families gathered around televisions replaying the footage. Mothers wept. Children watched silently. Grandparents shook their heads, remembering other incursions from years past, recalling the Second Intifada that had begun under similar circumstances. Al-Aqsa wasn't just a mosque. It was a symbol, a line in the sand. To storm it was to challenge an entire people. To resist was to affirm one's place in history. In the hearts of Palestinians, the echoes of resistance were not fading. They were growing louder. As night fell over the city, the dome of the rock gleamed under artificial lights. The silence was deceiving. The next morning would come. The worshippers would return, and so would the resistance. Despite the heavy atmosphere, the call to prayer rang out across the old city. It pierced through layers of tension and felt like a beacon of resilience. The muezzin's voice echoed from the minarets of Al-Aqsa Mosque, calling the faithful to Fajr prayer just before dawn. But this time, the call was more than just spiritual. It was a summons of defiance. Worshippers began arriving at the gates early, determined to reclaim their place of prayer. Most of them were elderly, women, and young men who had evaded the Israeli security checkpoints that dotted every street leading to the compound. They came barefoot, holding Korans and whispering verses beneath their breath. Some clutched rosaries. Others carried nothing but courage. Israeli police were stationed at every entrance, questioning identities, turning back dozens without explanation. Tensions flared when several youth were blocked from entering despite showing identification proving they were Jerusalem residents. A scuffle broke out. Officers shoved the youth back while shouting orders in Hebrew. Tear gas canisters were readied, but the protesters refused to move. "This is our mosque," they yelled. "We have the right to pray." Eventually, a narrow group was allowed inside, but under strict surveillance. Drones hovered above. Armed units stood along the courtyard edges. The spiritual calm of Al-Aqsa was pierced by the constant hum of machinery and the visible presence of a force prepared for conflict, not prayer. Worshippers lined up in rows on the cold stones. The imam stepped forward, voice trembling but strong, and began the prayer. His sermon after prayer was brief but thunderous. Al-Aqsa is not just stone and walls. It is faith, heritage, and blood. We will not surrender it. His words were met with chants of free Palestine, and with our soul, with our blood, we will defend Al-Aqsa. Many wept. Others raised their hand to the sky, praying for peace, protection, and perseverance. Outside the compound, protests grew. Women led marches near Salah al-Din Street, carrying banners reading, "Worship is a right, not a crime." Children joined, some holding drawings of the Dome of the Rock. Israeli security forces responded with arrests. Videos later circulated online showing teenage girls being dragged by their wrists. A wave of indignation swept social media, fueling further calls for mass mobilization. The Waqf officials inside Al-Aqsa worked tirelessly to restore calm and preserve the sanctity of the mosque. They cleaned the courtyards, reopened the prayer halls, and coordinated with medical volunteers to assist anyone injured during the previous day's clashes. But under the shadow of constant Israeli surveillance, even the simplest act, like unrolling a prayer rug, felt like resistance. Meanwhile, Israeli officials defended the actions of the police and settlers. A government spokesperson claimed the visits were legal and in line with Israeli law. Jerusalem is a united city. All faith may visit their holy sites, he said. But Palestinians saw through the language. They argued this wasn't about visits. It was about normalization of presence, enforced with weapons and barriers. International observers from humanitarian organizations attempted to enter the mosque compound but were denied. Some issued press releases condemning what they described as deliberate religious oppression. The United Nations called for an emergency session to address the rising tensions in Jerusalem. But for the people on the ground, statements weren't enough. They wanted action. They wanted justice. And above all, they wanted Al-Aqsa left in peace. As the sun reached its peak, more worshippers gathered near the gates, undeterred. A new call to prayer rang out. Despite the siege, worship continued. It was raw, determined, and unyielding. In every bowed head and whispered verse, the message was clear. Al-Aqsa is not abandoned, not forgotten, not surrendered. As the dust of confrontation settled temporarily around Al-Aqsa Mosque, it became clear to all watching. This was no isolated incident. It was a spark in a long-burning fire, one that had ignited movements, shifted geopolitics, and shaken generations. What happened in the courtyards of the mosque echoed far beyond Jerusalem's ancient walls. In Ramallah, a sit-in began at Menorah Square. Students, activists, and religious leaders joined together, raising Palestinian flags and chanting for justice. Makeshift stages were set up where poets read verses about Al-Aqsa's sanctity, Muslim clerics recited from the Quran, and Christian Palestinians stood shoulder to shoulder with them. Their message was clear. This wasn't just about Islam. It was about Palestinian dignity and the right to exist without constant siege. In the diaspora, thousands marched. In London, Paris, Istanbul, and Kuala Lumpur, global protests erupted outside Israeli embassies. Protesters held up in large photos of the mosque, images of Israeli forces charging in, and posters reading, "Hands off Al-Aqsa." Streets filled with chants, "Al-Aqsa is ours," and "Free Jerusalem." Across continents, Al-Aqsa became a rallying cry that united diverse voices. Back in Jerusalem, tension remained high. Settler groups, emboldened by the earlier storming, announced plans to return for religious ceremonies in the same compound. These announcements spread fear among Palestinians who saw them as clear provocations. The Waqf warned that such actions could lead to irreversible consequences. They appealed to the international community, to religious leaders, to anyone who still had the power to intervene. The Israeli government remained unmoved. "We will not allow threats to deter legal activity," a spokesperson said during a press conference. Meanwhile, military presence around the old city increased. Armored vehicles rolled through the streets. Roadblocks multiplied. The air was thick with anxiety. No one believed the worst was over. Despite the tension, worshippers continued to arrive. Each day, they faced searches, delays, and in some cases, arrest. But they came, with prayer beads in hand and devotion in their hearts. They insisted on filling the mosque with life. Mothers brought their children. Elders leaned on canes, and youth held hands in protective circles around the praying crowds. Al-Aqsa was not just a building to them. It was a beating heart that could not be allowed to stop. Inside homes, conversations turned somber and resolute. Families discussed the future. Could things return to normal? What did that even mean? For many, the incident only reinforced what they had long felt. Al-Aqsa would remain a battleground until the occupation itself ended. To defend it meant more than presence. It meant resistance in every form, from protest to prayer. Media outlets struggled to keep up. Palestinian journalists risked everything to report what was happening inside the compound. Some were arrested, others injured, but they persisted. Citizen footage flooded social platforms. Every angle of the storming was recorded, dissected, and reposted. The story refused to disappear. From afar, religious leaders issued statements. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem called the incursion a desecration that demands an international response. The Pope called for restraint, while leaders of major Islamic nations proposed an emergency summit. But action, as always, lagged behind rhetoric. And yet, amid all the chaos, something powerful persisted: resolve. Al-Aqsa stood tall. Its golden dome glowed beneath the Jerusalem sky, defiant and unwavering. Each prayer whispered on its grounds was an act of resistance. Each footstep that crossed its threshold was a statement. We are still here. We will not be erased. The struggle wasn't just about a moment. It wasn't about a single day of violence. It was and remains a reflection of a larger truth, that for a people denied freedom, every act of worship is an act of defiance, and every defiant act is a step toward justice. And so, the story continues.